I want to talk about how neoconservatism hijacked and twisted Maoism in the same way that the Nazis hijacked and twisted Bolshevism. And I was thinking about this, which is that typically revolutionaries, it's pretty clear cut, right? They see there's an institutional vacuum in the countryside, which there always is, by the way. Osos, what's up? There's an institutional vacuum in the countryside. Why? Because urbanization and urbanity is defined by proximity toward the reign of institutions. And rural areas tend to be pretty, by definition, they're neglected. They're neglected by the institutions. So what the American deep state did was actually pretty brilliant when you think about it. What they did is that they studied through extensive counter-guerrilla operations that were waged during the Cold War. The U.S. was actually involved in this and got this experience. Also, I wouldn't doubt that they studied Mao. Kissinger studied Mao. They all studied Mao. And they realized that one of the ways they could secure the longevity, not only secure the U.S. regime from potential partisan guerrilla threats internally in terms of its security, but also actually have a base of support to implement these sweeping structural and policy changes that they otherwise would not be able to get away with, is that they started doing what Mao did both during the Long March years of the 1930s and during the era of socialist construction, which was building up, filling the vacuum as far as rural education and rural soft power and rural institutions. And that was done. That was a top-down process. A lot of people think it was spontaneous, and it absolutely wasn't. So what the regime did, and if you follow the money trail, these was coming from the top. These were all cosmopolitan, urban educated. So you mean Jews? Yeah, actually, there were quite a few Jews involved in this. I don't know if I would say the majority of them, but it just goes to show this didn't come from the rural America. Absolutely not. It came from the highly educated, ruling class elite. But what happened is that they started, I don't know what order I would put this in, but the government anti-communism that couldn't be justified within the framework of U.S. democracy, the ruling class started funding the John Birch Society, and they started kind of getting involved on politics on a very local level. Joe McCarthy was a kind of demagogue with respect to this, right? You had the whole Southern strategy with Nixon, which was a huge part of this. And so eventually we start getting to these movies from Hollywood, which are like the culmination of this silent majority that was being cultivated, right? This kind of like right-wing Maoist tactics. And I think there's a few movies that come to mind. Red Dawn, Conan the Barbarian. I think they're directed by the same guy who literally called himself a Maoist. He said, "I'm so far right that I'm a Maoist." And it's pretty brilliant, right? And then Rambo, First Blood, absolutely falls within this category. Rambo, First Blood, right? The whole pop culture and soft power, nexus within the U.S. becomes defined by this strategy to encircle the sentiments of the cities with the sentiments of the rural Americans, right? It surround the cities by the countryside. And that actually gets used as a strategy and as a kind of tactic to implement policy changes, under Reagan. So Reaganomics and aggressive anti-communist foreign policy, confronting South America, and so on and so on. Because, you go to rural America and you wonder, why is it that you do have the predominance of this, reactionary consciousness? And a lot of Trotskyites like to attribute that to, well, rural people are just backward. They're reactionary by nature. And then you'll have some even Maoists claim, well, it's because they're settlers and these rural people in Appalachia, they're the ultimate beneficiaries of imperialism. But the truth is, you need to follow the money and see how, billionaires, Wall Street, the regime, the deep state, they spent untold billions and billions building up rural cultural infrastructure, more or less, to basically monopolize it where there was before a vacuum. They created this kind of rural soft power to define the consciousness of rural people. And rural people, they're poor, they're far away from the centers of consciousness within the country, and of course they take what's readily available to them. Of course they're going to take it. This is a standard Maoist 101 tactics. You go to the kind of marginalized periphery where people basically have nothing, and they'll take something rather than nothing. This is how you build a revolutionary base. But the U.S. deep state learned that they could actually do this without the revolutionary aspect. So this is something that was done for decades and decades. The Reagan phenomena, Reagan populism, and then the final one that I think is very overlooked is the religious revival that happened in the 1980s. The construction of the evangelical churches. Even you need to study the history of the evangelical church. The evangelical churches didn't come from the grassroots. It was a top-down thing, and that was really the stronghold for the rural strategy, to build up rural infrastructure. The church was created as a center of spiritual life, of consciousness, and all this kind of stuff. And it was absolutely a top-down initiative to monopolize the consciousness of rural people with religion, with the evangelical churches. So this is what they did, and they, this base that was built up in rural America ever since was used as the base of the Republican Party. Now, the Democrats did something similar, but instead of the rural white populations, they did it with black populations. One for one, pretty much the same thing. And in this way, you have these permanently consolidated populations that are at odds with each other. And if you notice the arrow of history of U.S. policymaking and the overall orientation of American foreign policy and the structural changes, it's all going in one direction. So, when people say it's a duopoly, it's not actually a lie. The Democrats and the Republicans, they've been kind of playing catch, hey, your turn, and they're going in the same direction. Clinton, passes NAFTA. This is a continuity. It's a line that's going in one direction, and it is a brilliant. It's the most brilliant application of dialectics by any counter-revolutionary regime in history, because what actually happened when you analyze it is that typically, you have this urban institutionalized monopoly, CIA, Harvard, the Ivy Leagues, Hollywood, the media, and it's kind of like Democrat oriented. This is the Democrats. These are the urban centers of U.S. imperial power, all the kind of bigwigs, so to speak, NGOs, respectable coastal elites, whatever. So the task is very simple. You go down to the countryside like Mao, you build a counter-hegemonic movement. But actually the Republicans were purposed for that task. That was already done. So that the same ruling class monopolized and consolidated the sole foundation of any actual resistance to the uniparty kind of orientation of U.S. politics in one direction. I'd say that this culminates in Obama. And Obama made the mistake, and this was a grave miscalculation on the part of the American ruling class. This was the big miscalculation on the part of the American ruling class was made under Obama. And the miscalculation was that now is the time that we don't have to play this red versus blue dialectic anymore, and we can have this great consolidation. We have Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and Obama come together, and we don't need this dialectic anymore. We have fully consolidated power up and down, it's over, so under Obama, you kind of saw the naked agenda of the ruling class kind of rear its head in a lot of ways. And for all intents and purposes, they consider this like the end of history. Like it's over. We finally don't have to do this, right wing Maoism anymore. And the liberals, for their part, don't have to do this kind of, this opposing tendency, I guess. And, Obama's supposed to be this great unifier. And I think that with Trump and the Trump phenomena, I don't think there's much evidence that points in the direction that he was planned to win. I think they opened the possibility he could win, and they would. And keep in mind, this is data for them. The ruling class, or the U.S. deep state, is not so much challenged by Trump as it is maybe annoyed that, oh, that guy won. That means we have to reorient our strategy in a really drastic and dramatic way. But ultimately, it's not that, Trump is a revolutionary or something, but he found an exploit. Developers of a video game, for example, if you want to put it this way, do they like when there's a hacker who finds an exploit in their game? Well, no, it causes them more work, but they appreciate it, and they absolutely will tolerate it in some sense. And even though they'll try to find people, let's see if you can find this exploit, right? They'll leave it open. And if people manage to, they're like, oh shit, there was an exploit we didn't know about. Now we have to patch it up. Of course, they would prefer that no exploit is found. But there was, right? That was Trump. Trump found an exploit in the system. And they were like, oh God, there's an exploit. But it was very easy for them to patch it up. And in a sense, they're grateful for anyone who exploits the system. Johnny, what's up? So they can patch it up. And that's what they've been doing since Trump was elected. The whole... So you need to understand there's some kind of dialectical awareness at the highest range of power, I think. Johnny, what's up, bro? Appreciate you for the 2. So this is the issue that, people who think that they're up against a regime that is undialectical, well, the facts show otherwise. It actually has a profound ability to adapt to exploits and to contradictions. And so, Johnny, what's up, man? Appreciate you. Thank you. What the fuck, Milkman with the 50? Holy shit. Bro. Milkman with the 50. What the fuck is up, bro? Wow. 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 Thank you, bro. Thank you so much. Let me continue what I was saying. So the so-called, right-wing Maoist strategy, Trumpism, was the leftovers of a strategy that by that time was supposed to be abandoned. The Republican Party didn't want to repeat the Reagan campaign of the 1980s. By that time, the Republican establishment wanted, to go the way of, Jeb Bush or Rubio, probably, right? I think he was the favorite always. He still is. And, Jeb Bush, Rubio, and these kind of people. Maybe Ted Cruz, although he was slightly a troublemaker for them. But of course, when I say troublemaker, I'm not talking about someone fundamentally against them. I'm talking about, somebody who's finding exploits and using them as leverage, Anyway, let me continue, okay? So, Trump proves that the Obama consensus fails, that the time for the great reconciliation is clearly not here, that in order to actually secure control and secure power by the U.S. hegemony, it still has a long way to go, basically, right? And I think you even hear people, liberals saying this in response to, well, we have a long way to go as a country in terms of fulfilling our dream of becoming a democracy, whatever. So the leftovers of the John Birch Society and the entire Republican rule strategy rise in revolt against the very same forces that propped it up in the first place, in some sense, right? And, of course, the Republican Party hangs on and doubles down on what it already has to further and continue its the overall long-term agenda of the U.S. regime, which, by the way, is absolutely blind to whether it's Democrat or Republican. These are different. See, right now we're witnessing pretty drastic steps taken in the direction of the, total overthrow of U.S. civil liberties and this would have happened under Obama, under a Great Reconciliation as well. It was happening under Biden, right? The regime needs different ways to spin it to the population in order to effectively govern and rule over us, right? That's what they need. They need different ways to spin it. And Trump, the way they spin it is, we're fighting Antifa, we're fighting terrorists, yada, yada, yada. And this is, a different flavor. For Biden, it's January 6th and, the MAGA extremists or whatever. But in any case, the orientation and the direction, the arrow is the same. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no contradictions within the state, within the hegemony. Of course there are. And we're seeing that this is laying the foundation of a U.S. Civil War. By the way, the U.S. Civil War is happening because of a systemic and structural necessity. Everyone is at their post doing their job as they're supposed to be doing, according to the logic of the hegemony itself, and that is at odds. That is revealing itself to be contradictory, and so this is why it's a real civil war that's going to happen. It's not because the Democrats can't get along with Trump. It's because everyone doing their duty and doing what they're supposed to do, according to the logic of hegemony, is actually creating a conflict. It's the same hegemony. It's just everyone's supposed to be doing what they're doing. Nobody's out of line. Nobody's rebelling. Nobody's revolting. Everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, including Trump and the Republican Party. Trump and the Republican Party absolutely have to dig their feet into the ground and consolidate the American peasant hinterland base that was created under Nixon and Reagan. Absolutely. If the U.S. loses, if the hegemony ceases to have a foundation among that base, if that base revolts against the Republican Party, you have a security vulnerability that could be exploited by an American Mao Zedong. So they absolutely need to keep pressing, and they need to stay at their post and do what they're supposed to. But the Democrats also have obligations. They also need to do what they're supposed to be doing, right? So this is creating the fertile soil of what's going to be the next American Civil War. But in any case, why am I talking about all this? Well, I'm talking about all of this because of the new guy Zohran and how he's pushing American politics left. And I want to remark upon the irony of why U.S. politics is as weird and strange as it is at the level of geography and at the level of politics, on a geographic level. So Zohran, it's so interesting because revolutionaries, or let's just say the left wing, has always thrived throughout history in, the strategy of dual power. And that doesn't have to be taking it to its logical conclusion like in a revolution. It could also be building up a foundation and a base of support among, populations that are just neglected by the core, by the institutional core of the hegemony. So for Mao, it was peasants. For Lenin, it was the peasants. Even the proletariat represented this niche, in the 19th century. It was an institutional niche. The proletariat didn't have its own voice. It didn't have its own institutions representing it. And this was a niche within civil society that the left defines itself by, submerging itself within to build a base and build a foundation against hegemony. What about Fidel? That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, okay? There were two lines within the Cuban Revolution. One where the city, intelligentsia and other kind of forces who, were against the Batista regime, but were not the decisive factor in the success of the revolution. The line represented by Che Guevara, which translated into the application of the Foucault theory, of, guerrilla warfare from the Sierra Mount. I want to pronounce it correctly. Anyway, that is actually what brought the Cuban Revolution to fruition. The Che embedded the guerrillas among the, again, rural Cuban population. How did the Cuban regime consolidate itself? By building up educational infrastructure in the Cuban hinterlands. That's actually the reason there's still a Cuban state that's independent. That's why. So, every state, creates a framework of control, okay? That's just what states are. They create a framework of some kind of exercise of power, exercise of state power, right? And states, at the outset, can only do that within proximity to their institutions. So the urban core. States and political power can design new cities. It can create new cities. It can plan cities. It can plan life. It can regulate life. It can create laws. It can create zoning. And it has all this immense control and power over the immediate geographic proximity to it on a logistical and material level. Its own ability to exert itself and exert itself as a power. Now, rurality, which some people associate with agriculture, but should more broadly be identified and understood as a kind of opposing tension to the core of state power. Bolshevik, what's up, bro? Appreciate you. This is always a kind of blind spot in any given state power. And party dictatorship, liberal democracy, it doesn't actually matter. The rural hinterland is always a blind spot by nature, because rurality is not premised by political power. It is the basis and foundation of the power. So whoever wins the hinterland, whoever has a basis and a foothold in the hinterlands, can rule the whole country. Because if you don't secure your rural hinterland, if it's unsecured, then rebels can rise against you. Like a Mao Zedong or a Che Guevara or anything else we see from, or a Genghis Khan for that matter, which is what happened actually. The Mongols allied with disaffected Chinese peasants against the ruling dynasty at the time. This is the reality. So the securitization of the rural population is something that was accomplished in two moments of history in the 20th century. In the Russian Revolution, after Stalin's 1928 first five-year plan, where the Soviet Union decided to embark on the direction of the socialism in one country. That's what it was about. Building up socialism in one country meant consolidating socialism at the foundation of the national element, which was the peasant, right? And then Mao, the example of Mao is just self-evident in terms of how it takes that logic to a further conclusion. And every revolution in history really, is based on this logic, of securing the countryside. So what's interesting about the U.S. regime is that it is the absolute culmination of the bourgeoisie, the urban, cosmopolitan, educated, advanced technological consciousness of the bourgeoisie. It's just the absolute culmination of that, right? It's the machine-like entity and form of domination and control and whatever would have you. But through the experience and the study of counter-guerrilla, and through the study and experience of counter-guerrilla warfare, I should say, throughout the Cold War, I think that the U.S. deep state or deep state actors in the ruling class understood there was a niche in the U.S. countryside, which there was. And to prevent left-wing forces, future potential revolutionary forces, from gaining a foothold there, we have witnessed this kind of gradual process of the Republican Party building up a base and a foundation there. and through the monopolization of institutions, the building up of institutions, to give a voice to these people that otherwise wouldn't have a voice in the kind of, you know, and the subtleties of this are very interesting because, you know, for example, you have under FDR, you say, well, the New Deal Democrats, they started the elitism. And it's like, well, no, Henry Wallace, for example, was a voice of the American farmer. The New Deal wasn't a one-sided dictatorship of the urban intelligentsia. You had people like Henry Wallace. You had this kind of shakeup that was created, which was agrarian and populistic. I mean, that was a part of the New Deal coalition and the lineage and the history, at least. But this changes. You have a very what's really kind of striking is this extremely intentional, methodical, and engineered consciousness that was created in rural America, which is not spontaneous. People think, well, country folk, that's just their spontaneous consciousness. And it's like the readily available means of education that exist in rural America, whether we're talking about, you know, the school systems, or whether we're talking about the types of media that's tailored toward them, or whether we're talking about the kind of ideologies that proliferate from the churches and other kind of centers of influence, the arms industry and all this kind of stuff. And also, let's not forget the pipeline of the U.S. military, which recruits from this place historically. There's a monopoly on the means of consciousness that is just so intentionally it's like the Matrix. It's intentionally engineered and designed to produce anti-communist, pro-imperial consciousness. And you know, what's that book about how Kansas used to be a communist stronghold? Like, this is what I'm talking about. This is not just a mere consequence of rurality that they're going to have these intensely backward reactionary ideologies prevail. This was designed and engineered in a very, very intentional way, right? So you have an irony in U.S. politics where the so-called left gave up, the fight for asymmetrical counter-hegemonic politics. The left stopped trying to create a foothold in the hinterlands where alternative forms of dual power would be possible. The left became an extension of the Democratic Party and was just a kind of cultivation and elaboration of the urban consciousness, the institutional consciousness. So, the left wanted to develop out of universities, and it wants to cultivate those kind of demographics, professional managerials, artists, city folk, so to speak. And then it's like, it's so incredible because I forgot to mention the country music industry, which is another story, right? But, so the left is a hegemonic consciousness in America, or the leftists represent a hegemonic consciousness. It's politically correct. It's aligned with the system. I mean, historically, I'm talking about. Now things are interesting and changing, it seems like. And the right wing has, hijacked and appropriated Maoism in a lot of ways, right? So, this brings us to the culmination of what I think is the furthest you could take, the most radical and furthest you could take leftist politics in America, which is Zohran Mamdani. And Zohran Mamdani is winning in New York City. New York City is the center. It's like one of the geographic centers of the hegemony within the USA. And then you look at the demographics of who supports Zohran, and it's not exactly the working classes of New York, by and large. You have a strongly represented element of, we call them the bourgeoisie, the professional bourgeoisie, the champagne socialist liberals and so on. And this is what's going on in NYC. And it's a profound irony that this is where we're seeing quote unquote socialism. Now, there's a lot of retard hipsters like Donald Parkinson, for example, he will try to spin this as a repeat of, the historical urban proletariat asserting itself politically. So, for example, the cafes of Paris in the 19th century, or in London or something, and he'll say, "This is, this has always been the base of socialism. It's always been." And these democratic socialists and these people who are running cover for Zohran and claiming this is a viable form of or sustainable form of politics, I should rather say. And it's just a sad LARP from the 19th, attempting to repeat the 19th century and the 21st century within your imagination and pretend like you're going through the motions of that and it's all happening again, and it's really not. It's something completely different. There is no basis among the proletariat for Zohran. Zohran is the epitome of what you would call a bourgeois socialist. He's tapping into an absolutely bourgeois zeitgeist. He's a trendy bourgeois kind of politician. Among the bourgeois cultural elites of NYC, he's the most popular, And this is not even a moral claim. This is just a description of objective fact. Zohran is the culmination of what is possible within the realm of bourgeois socialism. And what I want to say is that the consequences of Zohran are tragic to me and very sad, because based on what I've already told you, what is actually going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is that because there's such a severe disconnect between the Democratic Party and its consolidated base and the base of the Republican Party throughout the country, Zohran is going to be made the face. He's going to be used as fuel to further the red versus blue dialectic very effectively. You show a bunch of uneducated country bumpkins, this Muslim communist is taking over New York City, and it's going to very tragically produce this is a tragedy of leftist politics in the US, by the way, because leftists for over a decade have just been volunteering themselves as ammunition for furthering the red versus blue kind of dialectic of consolidation and control. Because all it takes is the Republicans to shock the let's call them the rural masses with something very foreign, unfamiliar, and distant from them. And it actually helps the Republicans. When Democratic centrists claim that, it's actually not entirely wrong. It does help the Republicans. And then the Democrats have to rein in the left. And the Democrats do that pretty effectively, because there is that profound gap and disconnect. And then B, because the Democrats, of course, have the means to. So this is an indulgence in excess of urban existence. That's what Zohran is. It's just an indulgence. It's a kind of decadence of U.S. politics in one direction. And again, there's no... Now, how do you break this dialectic? So, for example, if you're trying to create a rule strategy for socialist or left-wing politics in the U.S., how can you compete with the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars, the evangelical churches and the overall, the billionaires, shadow billionaires that fund rural infrastructure? I mean, how do you compete with that? Well, it's actually not a completely hopeless cause, but it does require a profound degree of patience and discipline within the Marxist intelligentsia, as I'd like to call them. You have to articulate the various symbols and signs that, yes, did originate with, Zionist elite billionaires brainwashing people with a bunch of this shit. And you have to understand it has a symbolic, unconscious significance, so to speak, that is not simply superficially ideological. And you have to be patient with that. You have to be patient with people that, are waving the you should even steal some of the symbolism. So, for example, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the Betsy Ross flag, the various expressions of libertarian sentiment or whatever. You have to understand how these are tapping into a real material existence, and you have to wage a kind of asymmetric war within the countryside against the hegemony, but within the realm of consciousness. And this is absolutely possible. It is absolutely possible to wage war at this level. It is absolutely possible to more or less go toe-to-toe with forces that can outspend you by billions and billions of dollars. It starts by building a foundation, very small and slow and steady, in the small towns, and a direct type of contact between, let's say, party cadre and these type of ordinary common people, the masses. You have to start out slow, and you have to start out very patiently, but there is a kind of exponential factor, or what do you call it, a compounding factor, if you can actually tap in to class consciousness there. It doesn't matter how much billions the hegemony spends and so on, because the advantage that Marxists or Maoists or whoever you want to call it have over the ruling hegemony is that they can actually correctly give expression to the truth in ways that people find compelling, actually. So you can win the war of consciousness by actually being correct. There are various allowances the hegemony has to make to rule America, the Republican Party, I mean. It has to make allowances for the populistic sentiment. It has to make allowances for, certain superficially anti-elite sentiments. It has to make allowances for, the realities of blue-collar workers. It has to lower itself to their level and talk to them and try to be recognized with them, right? And, this is, for them, an allowance, but for us, we are actually articulating a very real contradiction, and we could do it directly without having to kind of repackage it. And again, you go back to the time where communists had a stronghold in Kansas and these kind of places, and think about even the term redneck. Why was it even, where did it come from? It came from miners who had the red bandanas around their necks or whatever, right? The red scarves. So, the biggest obstacle is the confusion created among the intelligentsia by the strategy of the right wing, let's call them the right wing Maoists, so to speak. That causes a lot of confusion, and it causes a lot of metaphysical confusion and idealism, and it causes a lot of, well, wait a so this is why, like, ACP, for example, my party, will get labeled as right wing and fascist and all this kind of stuff, because we're undoing, in a lot of ways, decades of the right-wing rule strategy by correctly articulating, in many ways, the consciousness, or let's say the material reality of the American hinterlands. And most leftists see that as inherently right-wing coded. They say, well, this is the right wing. Well, it's right-wing coded because the right wing has had a monopoly on these populations for decades. And part of undoing that also means being patient with, the various types of consciousness that have emerged there. I'm talking about the libertarian sentiment. I'm talking about all sorts of different, there's not a single example of being able to have a dialogue with working class people if you're not able to be patient and tolerate them going on long, angry rants about whatever stupid thing they saw on Facebook. Oh, Zoran Mamdani, he's a Muslim communist. He's ruining our... Let them talk. Let them get this off their chest. And then once they do this, you can actually have interesting conversations. But then what do leftists do? They get reactive, they get emotional, they take it personally, and then they feel ideologically insecure themselves. And I think this opens a very interesting kind of post-cultural revolution question for Marxist consciousness in the 21st century, which is our consciousness, as communists. Forget about pandering to people. Forget about being patient. We ourselves have to have a relationship to the tradition of communism and to Marxism and Marxism-Leninism that is not just superficially based in images and phrases and slogans and words. We have to have an ability to perceive and be perceptive with respect, let's say the deeper symbolic unconscious significance of our tradition, of the revolutionary tradition. And that absolutely does mean a kind of wider historical meta-narrative about what Marxism actually is. Is Marxism a doctrine, an institutional doctrine from the 19th century, or does it reflect something that, has, let's call it, metaphysical teeth that is ancient, Is this something bigger? Can we forgive non-overt and non-explicit manifestations of what happens to be the same underlying logic of a revolutionary consciousness, while of course being committed to clarifying and correcting it? But can we perceive and recognize the flame of a revolutionary sentiment and consciousness beyond the superficial images and slogans and phrases? That is absolutely necessary for having a correct internal consciousness. It's not simply for the pragmatic case of winning over rural people. You yourself need to have an understanding of Marxism that is beyond the surface, that doesn't confuse appearance with essence. And that's very important. So Zoran will fail, and the tragedy, to get back to that, well, why we know he can fail is because we can anticipate what exactly will happen. The Republican Party will make Zoran the face of the Democratic Party, which is not a pleasant face to most Americans. And then some left say, well, it's just a matter of people knowing. I'm treating this as a matter of good faith. Like, for example, if Zoran stands for protecting the public sector and social welfare and whatever, it's like, well, that's fine, but you have a huge bridge to gap with at least 50% of the country. And if you don't bridge that gap, you're just adding fuel to the fire of the, American Civil War II, which is inevitable anyway, for sure. But you will never win within New York City alone. It's going to be very easy for consensus to be built. For example, if the Trump administration decides that they're going to unconstitutionally remove Zoran from power in New York City, they will have at least the consensus of 50% of the country. At least, which is not good. And then all it takes, once you have that solid 50%, all it takes is to slowly corrode whatever stronghold you thought you had in the urban core either. I think we saw that in 2024, where it wasn't just 50% voted for Trump. It was a bigger margin than that, right? Rather than Biden. So the left will never have a reliable basis in the urban core. It can succeed in some adventures, for certain. It can succeed in some adventures within the urban core. It can have protests and marches. It can become popular within a university momentarily. It can influence some policy making. It can get on the city council. It can get mayor of New York City, which I think is the culmination of this. But that is not a reliable, solid foundation. You're just waiting to be. How do you consolidate? That's the question. How do you consolidate that into a victory in the long term? Well, you can't. You can't. I mean, Trump might be unpopular. That's true, but that doesn't mean Zohran is popular across the country. That's your problem. Trump may be unpopular, but Zohran is also very unpopular. And that's not because people are inherently hostile to Zohran per se. He could have any views he wants. It's because a huge chunk of this country is just consolidated and brainwashed by, you know, one of the layers of the hegemony. It was evangelical churches, military kind of ideology, and so on and so on. The Republican Party itself. Is the Civil War going to be countryside versus cities? I think in part you're going to see that for sure. Yeah, that's going to be a factor for sure because it's not. Yeah, I mean that's going to be for certain one of the ways you're going to see that play out. I don't know if it's going to be like military confrontations between cities and the countryside, but it's going to, states that have more control over their let's say you have a Democrat governor and they happen to have a good grip on their state, the whole state will be uniform, you could say, right? But there's going to be security gaps, of course. So that's kind of how you have to think of this and these things. But Zohran, you have to be realistic, and the realism is that it might seem remarkable that he won in New York City, but it doesn't impress me because I think that places like New York City already have a slant and a bias toward, let's call it leftism, right? Liberal leftism. I would be much more impressed if this could translate into some kind of if it was more of a miracle, like if you're taking a Republican town, historically Republican town, and you have a leftist, let's say, win there. Even if that leftist happened to be part of that weird Trotskyite cult, the RCA, I would still say, hey, that's impressive. Even if it was some like retarded left liberal, I say, hey, that's impressive, But I don't see that. I think that you take a huge concentration of the professional and cultural bourgeoisie and you say, well, guys, no worries, they're voting for the leftist. Keep in mind something very sad. Zohran is regarded as the most left-wing figure in the U.S. politics today. So this is the best you're going to get, is this extremely unsustainable indulgence by New York City, right? And it's going to just immediately collapse and regress into the kind of, the current trajectory of U.S. politics. You think other big cities will have their Zohrans? They could, but remember, it's an indulgence. It's considered, for now, it's a kind of bourgeois socialist indulgence. And I'm not, I don't want to, I don't resent Zohran. I don't have an immediate bias against Zohran. I'm not here to position myself as someone who, has an ideological purity problem. I'm just trying to describe this in the most realistic terms that I can, actually, The realism of the matter is that Zohran is just not someone who can represent a popular strata within this country. You have to think really like Mao. You have to think dialectically. Why is it that rural should be privileged over urban when you are talking about political strategy, because the state is almost identical and perfectly symmetrical with urbanity. Urban existence is a type of existence premised upon intentional institutional, consciousness, that has more proximity to the center of power, okay? And rurality is defined by the opposite of that. Really, it is the definite opposite of that. So cities, for example, don't have the ability to consolidate. They don't have the ability to actually, how should I say, constitute themselves as a power in and of themselves. To think like Mao means to understand that everything has its basis in an opposing and contrary tension. And every state power is fundamentally going to be rooted in the opposing and contrary tension of its hinterlands, of its rural existence, right? That is actually the decisive element that actually determines where the power lies. If you can hold that, then you have power. If you can have a basis in that, then you have power. If you don't have that, then you are you might have a base within your immediate vicinity and proximity, which is urban existence, sure. But the foundation is at odds with you, right? And it's only a matter of time before it condemns you in some kind of way. That the foundation of a given thing is its contrary and opposing opposite is a very basic dialectical insight. So, for example, what is the foundation and basis of an idea? Foundation and basis of an idea is its contrary and opposing material premises, its material conditions, right? So this is how you have to think Marxism. And then, okay, I say all of that, and I mentioned dialectics and Mao, but I could also just tell you that a city can't feed itself. So there you go. New York City can't feed itself. New York City can't draw up an army from within itself and defend itself. Remember the tragedy of the Paris Commune and how Marx responded to that. Marx basically said that for something like the Paris Commune to succeed, the urban proletariat would have to make an alliance with the indebted French subsistence farmers for a real people's revolution on the continent, right? And this was the missing. This is why the French state could draw up an army, and crush it. I mean, the Bolsheviks would have been crushed if there wasn't for Lenin's insistence upon the democratic alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. Had Trotsky gotten his way ultimately, and there was no such alliance, Bolsheviks would have never had a foothold within the countryside, within the peasantry. And throughout the course of the Civil War, what did we find was the decisive element in the Bolshevik victory? Well, many of the peasants who were initially either ambivalent or either passively or actively lending their support to the White Army actually started defecting over to the Bolshevik side. Now, had that not happened, the counter-revolution would have been successful, in a way not dissimilar, let's say, to the Paris Commune. So you need to understand that this is the reality. I mean, you can't push politics left in any country if you are not somehow making inroads within the real foundation of power, state power, So, I don't foresee any timeline in which, Zohran is going to become a national phenomenon. So, to whatever extent people are thinking about Zohran, you should just frankly think of him in terms of he will fail as a phenomena. He's not going to push politics further left in this country. He's going to push it further right. He's absolutely going to push it further right. He's going to create the pretext, Yeah, AOC pushed American politics much further to the right, by the way. She absolutely did. And Zohran will do the same thing. You know, you need to just understand this realistically. I'd love to be challenged on this too, by the way, because Zohran wins because of this indulgence, this urban bourgeois indulgence. We're going to have this new regressive type of, it's just like that movie, Megalopolis, right? We're going to have this bourgeois socialist indulgence. And okay, he wins. Okay, well then the overwhelming power of a unified federal government that could draw upon a more or less more reliable base on the national element, the countryside, comes and crushes Zohran. What is New York City going to do? Hey, we're New York. You can't just do that, Trump. You can't just come and violate the Constitution and get rid of our mayor. Why not? Says who? Are New Yorkers going to wage a protracted people's war and urban guerrilla warfare against the federal government if something like that happens? I don't think so. What power will you appeal to prevent something like that from happening? What are you going to appeal to? What's the plan? I want to know DSA's plan. I really do. Whenever cities have to be taught and learn just how much they depend upon the hinterlands that surrounds them, it's never good for them. It's never good for the urban dwellers, so to speak. Okay, so someone was requesting, I'll bring them on, because I'd love to be challenged on this, or someone can just maybe explain why I'm wrong about this fact. Nobody. That's great. Well, one request. I really need a co-host because I can't see whoever's requesting. So let's bring on. See if Zoomer can be a co-host. I definitely need a co-host. It says one request to speak, but I can't see who it is. Okie dokie. Okay, Zoomer maybe can't co-host. Who can co-host? Harold. Can Harold co-host? Let me see. By the way, Elon Musk's X is so advanced and so profound that not only does it not have an urban X Spaces function, sorry, not urban, a desktop X Spaces function, it doesn't even allow the host to see who's requesting, which is so brilliant. Harold, when somebody requests, please bring them up. I guess at this point we're accepting anyone.
All right.
So I want to talk about something else, guys, which is a lot of people talking about Silwa. Okay, and I want to just shut this down right away and say that no, Silwa is, of course, the more reactionary candidate. It doesn't matter how much you like his aesthetics. It doesn't matter how much you like his rhetoric. It doesn't matter how much you like his sentiments and his sensibilities, which, okay, of course, are better than Zohran's. His character, his personality as a type of, I guess, like his sentiments. Of course, Curtis Silva is more likable, but what kind of politics does he actually represent? And that's what you have to really consider here. The Zohran, for all his faults, despite that I would call him a bourgeois indulgence, he does have or does represent a pretty radical politics, at least with respect to nominally or superficially criticizing Israel. And there are some pretty powerful entrenched interests who don't want him mean, when I say Zohran is a bourgeois indulgence, let me just be honest. Or sorry, not honest. Let me be clear. I'm not saying Zohran is the preferred candidate among, the billionaire class. I'm saying that the rule of the billionaire class has corresponded to the rise of a bourgeois consciousness, bourgeois civilization, bourgeois society, cultural bourgeoisie, right? And as a consequence of that, the decadence of that, it has turned into a type of insanity in some sense, which yes has risen in revolt against the billionaire class in many respects. But it has done so as a kind of in the same way that the children of the billionaires will rebel against their parents because their parents aren't giving them enough allowances. You see, so yes, there's a conflict of interest there for sure, but it's a conflict of that is a result of an indulgence in some sense. It's like the children of the bourgeoisie want more from their parents, and they're inadvertently advocating for things which would be very harmful for the entire family business, not realizing that their premise, this is what I'm talking about. If there was actual Maoist left-wing revolution in this country, the same people that are coming out for Zohran, a lot of the same people, I should say, the more kind of elite, posh, hipsters, whatever, they would be, the Muscadine. They would be at the vanguard of the counter-revolution, for sure. They would not be on the side of a true Maoist revolution in this country. They would be firmly with the counter-revolution, for sure, for certain. So transplant your average New York leftist, left liberal, DSA member to the October Revolution of 1917. These people would be in the cadet party, okay? That's where they would be. They would be in the forefront of the White Army and the counter-revolution. If you read John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, you see encounters like, some peasant sailors and soldiers are blocking a road, and these bourgeois sniveling intelligentsia will come up to them, and they'll protest and they'll yell and say, "What's going on? What authority do you have?" And these kind of, quote unquote, these dumb peasants will be reading them the scripture of Marxism, saying, well, there's a proletariat in the bourgeoisie, and the intelligentsia were in the book. They're yelling. They're like, "Why are you talking a theory to me right now? I don't need to hear your dumb, stupid." See, these poor peasants were learning theory for the first time in their life, So they were repeating what they had just learned, and the accultured intelligentsia was so outraged, This is an example of a kind of encounter. How do you think these sniveling, arrogant New York City intelligentsia, bourgeois elitists would actually react if there was a real, communist revolution in this country? They would not be for the communists. They would not be for the revolution. They would be the same as these people described in 10 Days That Shook the World, there's something about the politics of resentment where somebody that you thought was below you and less educated than you are and more stupid than you are starts to have power over you. There's something about like the resentment factor where it creates such a seething, visceral hatred. And that is very, very much manifest among these, it's literally coastal elites. Of course, that's what it is. This is why they got the whole Trump thing wrong. And, they have the same derisionary, belittling, mocking attitude toward MAGA communism. The primary attitude toward MAGA communism is not people getting offended or, shocked or upset. It is this, it was at least in 2022 when it first became like a thing. The thing I noticed the most was like the mockery. It was like the belittling. Oh, these dumb, stupid people are going to be communists. They don't have a Harvard degree like I do. What do they know about Marxism? And that was the default response. It was a kind of mockery, So that is their default attitude. Now, these educated segments of society orient more toward the left liberal, and Zohran has done a good job in becoming their champion. So here's what I think could be potential positives from the Zohran Mamdani failure, which he will fail. He may win the mayoral race. I'm not denying that he has a strong likelihood of that. I've heard people say he might lose. I don't know anything about that. I mean, I don't know. I'm not closing the door. I'm saying I literally don't know. But let's assume he wins. Like, what could be some of the positive outcomes from this failure? Well, I think that if left liberals who earnestly vote for Zohran on principle, regardless of their bourgeois attitudes and so on, if they realize their powerlessness, if Trump intervenes or something happens or he sells out, and I don't know, the hope is that it will provoke them to rethink their strategy. Hopefully, they start to take rural strategy more seriously. Hopefully, it encourages this new generation of kind of let's call them leftist militants to down to the countryside movement. They get serious about building a real national base for politics in this country, and maybe they join us. Maybe they join ACP in doing this, or I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have confidence they could do something better than we are. They don't. They don't have the intelligence. They don't have the ability. They don't have the resolve. So yeah, they would probably just join us, to be honest. I mean, I could lie and be like, well, maybe if they could do it better than us, I'll support them. They're not going to do it better than us. Okay, they can't, because it's not easy to do. And we're not extraordinarily incompetent or ridiculous. We're pretty normal people, and I doubt that the Harvard educated and Ivy League educated, city folk are gonna humble themselves to the extent our cadre do, with the same degree of patience and going down to the country. So that's just how I look at it, and the positives are people are gonna have to realize from the failure that you can't you can't push politics in any direction from New York City. Put it this way, okay? I want to put it into perspective. AOC is a member of the national federal government, okay? She's in Congress. What can Zohran do that AOC didn't? Is there anyone who sincerely believes, by the way, he can be successful? He's going to make New York City better and he's going to improve that's not within his control. Zohran cannot address the root causes of systemic dysfunction and the brutality of American capitalism. He can't address that from New York City. So why don't you just think about it? He's going to preside over New York City and be the face of. I mean, this will be very bad, actually, because he's going to be the fall guy for. Maybe there'll be a new Luigi who assassinates him because he'll become the face of the out of touch bourgeoisie who cannot address the root causes of the grievances of the working class. And you see that in Silwa, okay? There's a lot of people that support Silwa who feel that way. I'm not saying Silwa is better, okay? I think it's a mistake to say he's better. But he does represent that there's a disconnect here with Zohran, Zohran Mamdani. So that's my appraisal of the Zohran thing. Nobody joined the space to challenge it today, so that's sad. That's very sad. I was very calm today too. It's so incredible. But calm is boring, right? They're tapping into 2000s anti-Muslim rhetoric. Yeah, I've been meaning to make a post about the Muslim thing, the Muslim angle, which is interesting to me. I guess I'll talk about it here. Why not? I think that Muslims are more interesting now to Western consciousness than Jews. I think that Jews are boring for as the subject of modernity, and now it's Muslims. And I remember reading something about Jews and after the Holocaust, or after the experience in the 30s in Germany. I don't remember exactly which one. Dan, what's up? I appreciate you, right? Where many Jews in Europe had a very ambivalent status toward Jewish identity. They had a very indifferent status. They were pretty assimilated. They were secularized. They weren't particularly religious. And they had no special feeling or connection to their Jewishness. They were just like, well, I'm a German, or I'm a Frenchman. I mean, I'm a Britishman. Like at that point, they were just pretty distant from their Jewish identity altogether. You could say they were successfully assimilated, right? This is true for many Jews in Europe. But then the anti-Semitism in the 30s within Germany, I don't remember the exact quote. I remember reading a Jewish author who said this. It said something along the lines of, this cemented, it created like an irreversible, unforgettable stamp of Jewishness. And I will never forget that I'm a Jew now, It very much consolidated Jewish identity, made the reality of a Jewish identity clear. And it totally shaped the post-war American Jewish identity as well. Secular or religious, doesn't matter. And I look at Muslims who immigrated to America, Zohran or Hassan Piker, or, even me to an extent, and we're not particularly religious. I mean, I would say I think Hassan was an atheist. I don't know. I'm not going to say that like in a derogatory way. I don't know. Pretty secular, though. Zohran is pretty secular from my estimation. He doesn't strike me as a religious Muslim, and I'm not particularly religious. But the fact that Zohran is being made the object of a vilification in this way, that it's a Muslim thing, it's a Muslim threat, he's a terrorist, he's going to bring Sharia law, and the same is true actually for Hassan Piker. If you look at, when Piker allegedly shocked his dog, people made this about his Muslim identity. They said, well, this is how the Muslims feel about dogs, right? So the signal this is sending, the message it's sending, is that religious belief is irrelevant as far as Muslimness, that there's going to be this new Muslim identity that emerges probably that is unrelated to religion and more related to, well, the same thing that kind of glued together the Jewish identity. It's not related to religion. It's this more ambiguous alienation from Western civilization, this otherness. And I think that's going to take root in a big way among American Muslims after Zohran, Basically, I think Muslims are going to be the new Jews. And that's what I see happening. Because Zohran is not a religious Muslim by any means, but he's got a Muslim name and he's got that background, and that suffices. And there is a type of alienation that Muslims have toward America that it's not related to their belief, it's not related to their cultural habits. You can be fully assimilated. You can be just like any other American and be fully assimilated, but there is this distance. And I'm interested in how that develops. What is that distance? How does it develop? What form does that take? I find it interesting, So, yeah, I don't know. I find that interesting. I think that why is there such a pathological hostility toward Islam in America? Wade, what's up? And I think that, well, because there's a deep proximity, because America has a repressed Muslim nature, I think. America fears Islam because America is Islam. Isn't that a crazy fucking pill, right? I can elaborate on that, but let's bring Mr. Apocalypse. Mr. Apocalypse, what's going on? By the way, America absolutely outclasses Europe when it comes to the anti-Muslim sentiment. It's a lot of it comes from America actually, and it's imported into Europe from America. So this person, I brought them on. I don't know what's going on with them. Can't hear them. I think that look, I hate to say this because I come from a Muslim background. I have a Muslim name, and very intentionally so. But the way in which America is losing its mind about Islam and Muslims anticipates the complete and total victory of Islam within America. Maybe not like the conventional Islam, but a type of Islam that will prevail in this land. I don't know I don't know what kind, but America is too fascinated and interested in Islam to simply want it to be gone. It's admitting that there's something about Islam that bothers it and it is unable to noetically assimilate and make sense of. And therefore, America has decided to enter into a dialectical relationship with Islam that is not too different from, the relationship between the Mongols and China, or any other kind of supposedly completely contrary and opposing force. Yeah, America wants to dance with Islam, and it will, and it has been wanting to do this for a long time. I find it funny. I mean, people point out the irony that 9/11 happened and now it's a Muslim era. And you're right. America wanted to dance with Islam after, let's say, 1979 in Iran, and then it gradually, and then 9/11. America became fascinated with Islam. America wants to dance with Islam. America wants some kind of confrontation and an encounter with Islam. And this is creating a type of ironic synergy where now there might be a mayor of New York City who's Muslim. And who can you blame? If you can't blame a foreign invader Islam, you have to blame, or you have to recognize this was just what America wanted itself. America got entangled with Islam by itself. It wanted to do this, The Crusader, the neo-Crusaderism is a pathetic cope because America is not a Catholic country. And even if it was, you're ignoring a lot of interesting parts of European history. For example, the Franco-Ottoman alliance. America's certainly not a Habsburg land. It's not a Habsburg country.